So in the current state of corporate culture, right, many men hate corporate culture, they feel attacked by it, and a lot of them are working smarter. They're smartening up to not only the kind of gender bias against them, but also that, men might have different racial backgrounds, but they have a lot in common in terms of dealing with this type of weird anti-male bias that you have to see in this workplace, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of compare the agenda that's kind of creating this agenda tension between men and women, and how identity politics is leveraged against men, particularly white men, in a negative way that's impacted society. So we're going to start with this clip from a white conservative commentator, Megyn Kelly.
Years in this country. I just think that men, and this isn't racial. It's white, black, Hispanic. Men are sick and tired. It's not just of being kicked around. Men can take being kicked around, of being told you're nothing. It's more than that. It's worse than that. You're evil. It's that you're nothing. You can't have a job. You are no longer in the running in the American race to improve your life. You're out. It's the same thing as reparations. Yet earlier generations committed sins that must be revisited upon the present generation, even if they don't have a racist bone in their body, even if they weren't here their families weren't here to support slavery, etc. That's what we're doing to men. That's what we've been doing, and truly yanking the American dream away from them. And I really think that's what's baked into those numbers.
So before we go to this in a bit more detail, right? So firstly, we can see that there's many men who've kind of had enough, and this has been building for several decades, but I think it really picked up during the lockdown period. Many people in general, male, female, were questioning their life, questioning all sorts of dynamics, social dynamics, economic dynamics, but the patience for men for putting up with that double standard against them is kind of done. And you can sense this in society, whether it's men kind of being less engaged socially, dropping out of society, or just kind of not having the same patience for woke ideology or the bias against them, or pointing it out because it's gone too far. It's reached a point where it's like, why am I putting up with this and tolerating it? And one thing that's important to understand about the deepest drive for men and women. For men want to be respected the same way women want to be desired, right? So of course there's more to male and female psychology than just that. But if men are in a situation where they feel like they're being disrespected, that kind of aggravates them more than anything else. And this is what happens in this particular society, right? So men would rather either engage in society and be respected, or just kind of drop out and keep their self-respect. And that's what society kind of doesn't get. And this is what she was trying to address in this little comment here. And the thing is, she's talking about social hierarchies, right? In terms of social mobility, people moving up, or men moving up in society, whether it's through... So she's talking about men moving up through society, through social mobility, climbing the social ladder, whether it's through getting promotions at work, working effectively with the company they're at, moving jobs, buying bigger houses. Men are always about progress, building, climbing the social ladder, or making progress in their life, right? But if men are kind of stuck and there's no social mobility, there's no way of climbing the social ladder, anything you do say, even if you do climb the social ladder, you say one thing, it gets you cancelled, one woman can log false allegations against you, society is a general thing of treating men like second-class citizens. The thing about men is we're driven by hierarchy. You can talk about the male dominance hierarchy, which Jordan B. Peterson tends to talk about, and just general male understanding of the structure of society. And the easiest way to understand that is understand the military. The military in every country, which is typically, driven by masculine virtues, will have a very strict hierarchy. Because if you put men in a position, whether it's a company or anything else, and you make it a male-dominated environment, it becomes very hierarchical, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying it's always a positive thing. Sometimes there can be negative aspects to that, like bullying and talking down to people, because men are driven by hierarchy and who's better being on top in a more prominent position versus who's less competent. But that is just how men work, right, in terms of male psychology, right? And the thing is, what's happened is you have these men in senior roles, whether it's in corporations, in politics sometimes, but let's talk about corporations here. And there'd be like the baby boomer generation, or older men over 40, and they might be in prominent roles. And in order to maintain their roles, they have to push this type of gender ideology that is biased against men. And those men, they didn't deal with as harsh biases against them, but they enforced that to maintain their particular position. So if you have a manager who's maybe 40 plus, he is set certain performance objectives at the corporation he works for. And they say to him, well, one of your performance objectives based on diversity and gender quotas, we need you to hire maybe 60% woman because we need to improve the gender balance at a company that has many men working there. So it makes it more difficult for men to work there or find a job there or get promoted. You might be willing to overlook certain performance standards for women compared to men to maintain this kind of illusion of gender equality, right? And what ends up happening is there's a double standard there, right? And the most obvious case of this, if you ever want to check it out later, there's an interview or a few interviews that Piers Morgan did with Andrew Tate. And I don't agree with everything Andrew Tate said, but if you look at the different level of reaction they have when it comes to gender dynamics, it's because they dealt with a much softer version of feminism in earlier generations when Piers Morgan, who's 50 years old, dealt with that versus someone who's younger, like Andrew Tate, someone who's in their 30s, or even people who are in their 20s who dealt with a much harsher form of that feminism, right? And when you log in there, when you add in the economic dynamics, being unable to buy a house, have a family, things like that, men end up seeing this as a rigged game, and it is a rigged game, and they end up feeling like they can't succeed, and that's when they tend to drop out and just not be too engaged in corporate culture. Because the way men work, if you think about an all-male workplace, even a construction site, it does involve some jokes that might be politically correct, some kind of banter, some kind of taking little cheap shots at each other as part of the banter. But if you can't do that because anything can be deemed offensive or hurt people's feelings, then you're going to have less men engaged in the workplace environment. And when we talk about this attack on masculinity, right, having this term toxic masculinity, there's no such thing as like toxic femininity. And we can also consider things where... To bring in politics briefly here, where Barack Obama was kind of saying, oh, men should be voting for Kamala. If they don't, they're kind of misogynists, or they don't think a woman should be in a position of power, things like that. And the thing is about men, when it comes to the workplace environment or politics or elsewhere, we kind of don't respect like weak, effeminate leadership. Let's just put it that way, right? So when you do have that at workplace, it's hard to respect some of your managers at work, if we're honest here, right? Are they strong masculine leaders like you've maybe seen in the past at different countries? You kind of don't have that, right? If we're being honest here, in many cases, there are people that you do respect at work, of course, but it's kind of like society has a bias when it comes to dealing with men specifically. It's kind of a bias against like rational, logical, critical thinking men. They're seen more of as a threat because they can see through all the lies. But if you're more of an emotional, effeminate, liberal man, you agree with all the woke ideology, you're more favored. You're more like easier to control. You're more domesticated. And that's why you see a lot of those people in positions of power. More prominent examples in politics would be someone like the leader of France, Macron, or the leader of Canada, Trudeau. Those are the types of personalities that make it to some of these senior roles. And all the other men who demonstrate even a modicum, a small element of masculinity, of having boundaries, setting perimeters, things like that, they're kind of looked down upon as something's wrong with them. They haven't evolved enough. They're more kind of Neanderthal or caveman type of thing, right? They're kind of too focused on an old, traditional, outdated form of being a man. This is what you typically see in this modern society these days.
Or women in general genuinely don't have any natural interest in STEM related topics, and so they have to be incentivized to do so. They have to be exposed to it, right? Women tend to be more of nurturers. That's where they naturally excel when it comes to healthcare. Men tend to be more logical and masculine, and then you don't see women being line workers as far as jumping up on these poles and making sure that the electricity is back on naturally. You don't see women naturally going into being welders. You don't see women going into skilled trades. That's generally been reserved for men, not because they haven't had access to it over the last however long, but because that's just who we naturally are. And so you got to incentivize them to do something that they wouldn't normally do. And so we're being held accountable for the fact that we're men. If I go into a job and a woman is already there, cool. I got to get my money. I got to take care of my business. My masculinity tells me that I got to take care of my family. But if you're asking me to select a leader that is just a female, then I'm not saying that women can't do the job. But if you're asking me to just naturally overlook my God-given masculinity to elect a female to lead me and to stand in front of some of the hardcore world leaders, you got another thing coming. And I know that we feminize men, and that's feeding into it. I know we got a bunch of simps that want the approval of women, and so they're going to do whatever it is that they got to do to get that attention. But I'm going to just tell you that men have been left behind. And if you want to understand the greatness of any society, if you want to measure it, it's according to how great the men are. And it doesn't mean that we don't listen to women or we can't take it into consideration. But at the end of the day, we are who we are. And so there's been a war, an attack on men when it comes to relationships.
So he's got many good points here that we've kind of run through there, right? Now, firstly, I want to talk about something that links to the previous video I made a few days ago around the Google employee James Damore, where he talks about gender differences, right? And this is what I mean. This society is doing everything to subvert natural law, right? Men are naturally more technical, women are more nurturers. So men might be more inclined to work in STEM, science, tech, engineering, mathematics, things like that. Women might be more in tune to being nurses, teachers, where they can leverage their natural nurturing, caring instincts, right? And this is called natural law. It's perfectly worked for many years, and it's not that men necessarily always want high status jobs. Many men work in manual labor because that's part of the technical skills that men have. It's not just technical skills in the sense of coding or mathematics. And the thing is, because this system is so focused on undermining just even basic nature of men and women, like I said, undermining everything with ESG and all these type of agendas, what ends up happening is that rather than incentivizing men to be men and women to be women and have like an efficient society and community, is doing everything against that.
As men in general, especially white men, black men catch it, Asian men catch it, all men catch it. But the biggest enemy in the United States of America right now is white men. They don't like white men, and they are absolutely, positively against anything that is going on when it comes to uplifting white men. White men have become the enemy, which is one of the reasons by default they are starting to label Trump the way that they're labeling him, even though they loved him all the way up until he ran for president of the United States of America, and he won in 2016. And even when it comes to evaluating the two performances between the Harris-Biden administration and the Trump administration from 2016 through 2020 and 2020 through 2024, the last 3.5 years versus the 4 years that Trump was in office, it's a vast difference. But we've been so programmed to hate men that we're pushing a woman that never qualified to be here in the first place because she never had to debate her way through a primary. She never had to win this election. She was just given to us. And I even predicted it to an extent. I got a couple things wrong, but I predicted 1 or 2 scenarios would happen, and it's playing out exactly how I expected it to. And so they pushing this woman in front of y'all face, even more than they pushed Hillary Clinton. And they spending billions upon billions of dollars to try to get her elected. And because men are not going for it, because we are informed, and even though we've been silenced, and even though we've been Me Too'd, and even though we've been accused of things that we're not guilty of, now there's a war against masculine men that even take care of their families. And I've seen it firsthand. I've seen it firsthand. And Megyn Kelly is 100% correct. And this is one of the reasons, because men tend to not see things just across racial or party lines. Men tend to be a little bit more logical.
And he's pointing out, and he understands the bias against white men, men in general, black men, Asian men, so on, but specifically white men. And that's something I noticed at work, but I realized this demographic doesn't stand up for themselves. And also, they seem to let white women walk all over them, who typically push in the front line of pushing a lot of these agendas. So it really does make you think, right? And I always think about, when you're at work, who's looking out for your best interest? There's no one really, right? And you can look at politics in the same way. I don't think we should make everything about identity politics, but as a man, who's kind of really looking out for your best interest? And that's why you do see men kind of opt for internet forums, right-wing Twitter, 4chan, different types of websites and forums and YouTube channels like this maybe, where you do have a bit of an outlet for, if you're dealing with an anti-male culture at work, at least you can go somewhere and be free to express the reality of what you're dealing with day to day, right? And it's really like an agenda to push men and marginalize them outside of work and outside of society because they're seen as a threat to the establishment. And this is what it comes down to. If you're driven by logics, facts over emotions and feelings, then it's not really going to work out for you in this corporate culture that is very emotionally driven, very driven by feelings and caring about employees in a very fake, superficial way. And this is why I'm using this metaphor about politics here. He's kind of more referencing, Kamala Harris, and in this context of his broader discussion here. The point is, Kamala Harris is a reflection of a lot of career women you might deal with, where they're pushed to positions of power and you're really suspicious. How did she all of a sudden get to that senior role? I mean, she wasn't particularly popular before. What was going on behind the scenes however inappropriate that might have been, or whoever's seeing her as a favorite or an easy pawn to control from a senior level, did they put that in her in that position because she's easy to control, because she's a puppet, because there's a gender quota to me? It makes things very suspicious, and it creates a lot of resentment, because a lot of men see, hold on, you've got this highly incompetent person in a senior role, all the people in America, and Kamala Harris is the VP. I mean, all the people in the Democratic Party, and Kamala Harris is the VP. It makes things very suspicious, and it creates that resentment because it just doesn't make sense. Whether you agree with the politics or not, you think, hold on, everybody in politics, and this is the right choice that you've made for this role. And back to what you see with the Kamala Harris campaign, it reflects in a corporate environment too. And from her perspective, it's all about entertainment and joy and feeling positive. It's all about style, Beyonce, celebrities like that, rather than substance, right? And it's a metaphor for the workplace too. Everything's about this fake nice presentation, whereas men want to get down to the nitty gritty of what the actual work is and get it done. And when you take that out of it, or you make that a secondary focus, then you're just going to have less investment from men. And you can see, and Megyn Kelly pointed it out, she's the woman at the start of the video, she was kind of pointing out how different the messaging is for men versus women. And there's a lot of double standards like that at work. And to focus on the messaging that women receive versus men, which is incredibly positive for women, let's look at this next clip here.
Their comeuppance. The fact of the matter is that women get away with all kinds of shit in today's day and age, behavior that society would never tolerate in a man. Few men stand up to women because doing so is a kind of social suicide in today's political climate, though that doesn't eliminate the desire to see it happen.
So, firstly, he's talking about how women get away with a lot, and we've all seen instances at work where they're making mistakes, maybe due to diversity or kind of hiring or promotion quota. They might get that overlooked. There's like a lack of accountability, a responsibility for men to be extra helpful. If they're not, they'll be labeled misogynistic or something like that. And what he talks about, social self-deletion, which is true not only at workplace but in social environments, even what I'm doing now, right? Oh, you spoke the truth about the bias against men, oh, you're cancelled, in one way or another, right? Whether it's your career, whether it's your social dynamics, that you're going to be attacked. And if you don't believe me, go and try that one time at your workplace, try it in your social circle. In most cases, you can only express some of these opinions online, and even that's limited. But yeah, like I say, if next time in your social circle, point out some of the biases against men, and more often than not, you're going to have the woman in the social circle attacking you for pointing it out like it's not a big deal, or the men, the simps, the beta males, the orbiters, whatever you want to call them, who are also going to push this type of agenda against you.
For the simple reason that women tend to spend more money than men. Men might make more money, but women spend more money. Over 85% of consumer purchases in the United States are made by women, which is why such a huge proportion of advertisers tend to cater to women's values and sensibilities. Marketers have learned that tapping into female fantasy can be insanely profitable. And the way this is done, at least among many content creators online, is by making women feel right. The creators who can make women feel right, well, I'm not going to name any names, there are many creators online who do this very, very well. Though they may not be exhibiting a high degree of integrity, they are clearly savvy businessmen. And some of these creators, especially the men who do this, are making a metric shit ton of money off these women by telling them exactly the fuck they want to hear. And the ones who do this the best are actually very attractive. Like, they tend to be good-looking men. They work out, they dress nice, they talk sweet. And this, of course, is an important component of the production. After all, the part that women always leave out is that they want all the things they want from the men they are attracted to. Without that attraction, they are much less interested. And these men are extremely good at reflecting back to women what they already feel and believe, which is generally what women want to hear when they go to their friends or their therapists or their boyfriends for advice. That is, they want to hear that they're right and that the problem lies elsewhere. Between the attractiveness and the reflection, these men are functionally romance novel protagonists. They look how women want them to look, and they say what women want them to say.
So this is similar to male employees who are the beta males, or the simps, beta orbiters, however you want to describe them, the simp culture, where it's kind of a great career strategy. I've seen many instances where a corporation would create a dynamic that's focused on hiring and promoting women, and if a man gets behind her in terms of being the supportive work husband, the kind of guy just beneath her in terms of the corporate hierarchy, doing a lot of the work, helping her with a lot of the technical aspects while she gets the credit, he's kind of the man behind the scenes doing a lot of the work. And what will happen is he'll ride that wave to the top. As she gets promoted higher and higher levels, he'll be the one or two guys who kind of beneath her in the corporate hierarchy also get promoted above the corporate chain to higher levels as she quickly has an accelerated career path. So this is kind of a great corporate strategy. I've seen it many occasions. It's very common to see, actually, right? And this is what he means about being very presentable. If you're going to work and you're going to work, it's not a good strategy. But if you're going to work and you treat it like it's a date, you're all about being presentable, being quite nice to the female employees, treating it like you're almost going on a date with them, not in an inappropriate way, but the way you present yourself. Everything's become about presentation rather than being productive, actually getting the work done. So being a productive, smart employee, a hardworking employee is just the worst strategy to kind of have in many cases. It's all about being presentable and playing along with this kind of almost soap opera, sitcom kind of version of The Office these days. Now, when he's talking about, reinforcing whatever a woman's emotions are, whether it's they're never responsible for anything going wrong, fulfill their needs for, they're never accountable, they're never responsible. And that's what I mean by men going to work and playing this caricature for a lot of female employees of being the supportive boyfriend, the supportive husband of any of their emotions. I remember a couple instances early on in my career before I realized this is a waste of my time and I avoided it, where a female employee might be say, oh, let's go for a coffee and like a brief walk, a brief break from the desk. And then we'll go to get the coffee and then she'll just be venting about everything in the office, some other female co-worker she doesn't like, how she's kind of annoyed. She just wants to get her emotions out, basically, right? And this is where that funny term comes up of a man being in a friend zone, emotional tampon, where a woman will dump her emotions on a man. And after once or twice, I realized this is a waste of time. So anytime a female employee, or really employees in general, want to go and grab a coffee, I'd rather go and get a coffee myself and have some peace of mind away from work. But normally I just avoid that. I just say I'm busy, I'm working on something, I've got a meeting coming up I need to prepare for, because that's really a lot of these men, they are the work husbands, however you want to define it, emotional tampon, things like that. And it's interesting because in a lot of those dynamics, female employees might have a kind of vendetta against another female employee. It's not necessarily her complaining about another man, but this type of weird dynamics you have to put up with.
You're single because as a beautiful, intelligent, high-achieving woman, you're just too intimidating. Any man who isn't interested in you is just too insecure in his selfhood or fragile in his masculinity to be the partner you deserve. Or the reason why your relationship failed is because you loved too much. You lost yourself in your loving. And so it's important to maintain appropriate boundaries moving forward. And this vulnerability, unfortunately, was exploited by a selfish and opportunistic man. But don't worry. One day, you'll find someone who can meet you at the depth of your feeling. A man who isn't afraid of his emotions. A man who isn't afraid to communicate. A man who isn't afraid of real intimacy and commitment. A real man, etc. These men tell women exactly what they want to hear, and these women eat.
Because a lot of the time, right, you might be thinking, oh, you're going to work, so you've got to play along with the corporate facade and make sure the company looks good. But now you've got to go to work as a man and make the company look good, but also make the other female employees look good. And it's kind of weird. It's not just the company, the manager you've got to look out for. It's like other co-workers and other pick up the slack. That's typically the approach to men at work. You've got to pick up the slack for everything else. And I mean, if you want to play this strategy that could help your career, you're constantly providing the relief, comfort, security, saying she was right all along, it can work out for you, and I have seen it work out for many men. And if you point this out, even in a jokey way, people do kind of take it the wrong way and get offended.
It's ostensibly positive emotions. It's completely saturated with them, in fact. Love, hope, confidence, self-respect, empowerment, in order to give the impression of emotional resonance without really saying anything at all. And of course, that all might be well and good, except for the fact that a lot of this is complete and utter bullshit. Most of it just isn't true. These men are tapping into a latent fantasy. Granted, a fantasy that seems less unpleasant and destructive than the male fantasy previously discussed, but a fantasy nonetheless. And a fantasy isn't real. By definition, a fantasy is not aligned with reality. And this is a problem. This is because when things are built upon foundations that lack structural integrity, they tend to fall apart at the slightest challenge. And I think we can definitely see that in today's day and age. Are modern women more resilient today in the face of critical but potentially honest feedback, or less?
Think about the corporate messaging. It's constantly about female empowerment, love, confident, hope, empowerment, self-respect, strong, brave, courageous, hashtag girl boss, hashtag me too, hashtag believe all woman. All these type of things are constantly supporting them, women specifically, every day, but it's not really supporting men. If you really think about it, think about the messaging you get as a man at work or in society broadly speaking. We know the toxic masculinity thing, but it's either really kind of stale in terms of just very formulaic corporate language. This is the work to do, you got to get on with it on your emails, your work emails, things like that. But it's very different for women, and that's why women have a completely different experience in this society that they don't seem to understand when men in general do complain about some of this type of dynamic, right? And this is why we have a competency crisis. And if you look at some of my earlier videos from a few months back, I did cover the competency crisis, and the whole concept is that when you have complex systems, but you're not complex systems where it could be a corporation, technical work, the aeroplanes, flight systems. We have a very complex system. It might seem quite simple at times when you just log into your phone, or you just go and use a local grocery store or go to your office. All these construction sites that put together these complex skyscraper buildings, there's many elements to that are very technical, and there's men who are highly skilled on fixing the lifts and the elevators. A lot of these things we just overlook. We just think, oh, it's just a simple thing that's been around for decades. It's not really that complicated, is it? But all these complex systems are put together by highly competent people, right? And then when you remove that, and then you have people who are DEI hires, you have women in positions of power for the sake of it, you have men who are kind of working beneath them, not getting the credit, you end up having collapses in the system, right? Or little chinks in the armor. And you see this all the time, right? You see there's been many kind of completely ridiculous flight delays, flight scandals when, a plane goes down or there's some kind of technical issue and no one's really around to fix it. You see little things like this.
And I align with what makes sense.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I'm not the type of person to vote for a woman. I'm never going to select a woman to lead me.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So it's a little bit different with me, but...
So
just before we continue here, there's a little point I want to make. Now, the level of freedom of speech you have to be critical about corporate culture, broader culture, depends on which demographic you are, right? So, for example, a black man can say, I'm not really comfortable with female leadership, and the kind of level of brainwashing that maybe other demographics have been under, they're more restrictive on what they're allowed to say. But he can say that. It's the same thing where in the UK, the Muslim community might be more critical about rainbow flag community and to what extent this gender ideology can be taught to their kids in schools. But if other demographics or white people say this or white men say this, they'll be labeled misogynist more quickly, or anti-rainbow flag community, things like that. But they have a bit more freedom of speech depending on which demographic you have, which I'm sure I have a bit more or a bit less depending on how you look at it. And this is what I mean about corporate culture and why men hate it, even including men of different races, because they always want you to play into their narrative. If you're a man of color, you have to play into the liberal narrative of being a victim, with the white liberals giving you a pat on the head or treating you like a victim to play along with their narrative. And this idea that we're always going to align with this type of ideology or whatever fits the corporate culture at the time is not really going to work, because we like to see ourselves as independent of the system. I think if you really drive down into a male psychology, particularly these days, it's more about being free and freedom from this kind of weird social dynamic that they're pushing you into, this kind of slave dynamic in corporations. So it's very important to understand that first.
Who's the LGBTQ community?
Well, you know that they now look at them because, like, for example, with the civil rights movement, it's almost like the feminist movement, right? Or civil rights then led to women, for example, regardless of what color you are, to be considered a minority.
Yeah.
So now a white woman is a minority because she's a woman, even if she exhibited a level of power over black people, regardless if it was black men, right? And it's the same thing with the alphabet community, right? It's all being hijacked, and then you got the migrant crisis, and so everything is hijacked by each other. But now a other is anything other than a white man at this point.
The white man gonna be in trouble in the future.
I think he already in trouble.
Because
I think it's over for white men.
Well,
the most hated person in this country
I'm
is
about to say,
man. We can get away with saying anything we want to
but a white man can't.
Absolutely not, bro.
No, not a white man. No, not a white guy. So he's they in trouble. So but I'm telling people, homie, that's our biggest ally though. In the world, the white man is that's our real ally in this world. He'll fight with us and for us, even while we're fighting against him.
Yeah.
The white man seems like he the only one still love this country and want to hold on to the values and the things and the rights and the privileges that we have only in this country.
The ones that's preaching hope and joy, the Obamas, the Kamalas, it seems like they're creating a more divisive country. Because now everybody is drawing lines and saying, yo, you ain't black if you vote that way. Or I get more hate from people that look like me than from people that don't look like me.
Yeah, you and I both.
Now, let's talk about civil rights. Now, what he's mentioning here is how civil rights kind of turned into something else, and particularly when you had essentially the way feminism kind of started. It started with white woman looking for special treatment, if you look into the history around it, and then they kind of leverage POC or woman of color to kind of support their agenda of getting this special treatment. You can look back into history around that, right? And what he's pointing out is kind of interesting here is around the type of control and power dynamic going on. It's about people playing a victim and the workplace. He's talking about society broadly, but I'm talking about the workplace, where you can play the victim at work, and depending on how oppressed you might be able to define yourself, particularly if you're not a man, you might get a lot of special treatment, whether it's the trans, the migrants, things like that. And what he's making quite clear here, I was saying, around the biases around free speech and how far you can push back against this. And that's why I'm talking about some level of racial unity amongst men, even though we have maybe many differences, is around, to what extent white men let white women or the kind of liberal agenda walk all over them, right? And whether they're hated when you can see this anti-white agenda when it comes to US politics. But a kind of similar thing tends to work out at the workplace too, right? And this is what I mean about having some sense of unity and working together between the races when it comes to pushing for our agendas. There's many different ways to do this in kind of nice ways of looking out for each other in the workplace. I know it's easier said than done because everyone's kind of pitted against each other in some kind of competitive way, but it's worthwhile looking out for that. For example, if a woman makes a false allegation and you clearly know it's a false allegation against another man, regardless of the race, you can kind of point that out. If you're a man, there's no one really looking out for your best interest. Even the older men, like I say, in the corporate environment, they have an incentive to treat you like a second-class citizen because it's a benefit for their objectives of treating women favorably, giving them an extra help to climb the corporate ladder and the social ladder effectively. Social mobility is completely biased against men, I would say, for the most part in general, but specifically men in their 20s and their 30s, because a lot of those older men, they've kind of maybe more settled in life. They don't really pursue to the same extent climbing the corporate ladder that other men would, right? And like I said, it's always important for men to deal with corporate culture when they kind of do hate it, because there's so much focus on the emotions, hope, joy, things like that we've seen with the Kamala Harris campaign compared to, Trump's campaign, and how men would conduct themselves in general. We're not focused on the emotions, we're focused on the economy. That's how. We're not focused on, the stupid time-wasting tactics at work that are distractions. We're focused on the salary, right? So that's an interesting contrast there. And this is what I mean. Who is really sticking with you? And that's why there's a need for this type of unity. And we're going to focus on a final clip here.
Do you think that white people have less power than ever before?
Yes, and they mad about it. And I'm mad about it too. It was a much better country when white people had more power. They have less power, and they have a right to be afraid of what America's gonna come to, because we mad at the wrong white people. And today's white people had nothing to do with what our ancestors went through that none of us got to witness.
Facts.
But we want to punish them for it.
Yeah. But we didn't necessarily go through what our ancestors went through.
We didn't.
In order for us to have the type of hate and vitriol towards the people that's not even a part of what happened in yesteryear.
That's what I'm talking about, homie. And so imagine us with that attitude and sentiment, and then all the migrants and the foreigners coming in with their attitude and resentments just toward America. And we joining in with them to go against a country that freed us, feed us, educate us, and clothe us.
Yeah.
So what's interesting here is because a lot of these divisive narratives, they're not just in politics, they're not just in society, they exist in broader society, and we all have to deal with them in the corporations too, and they typically try to benefit of this type of racial rhetoric, right? And that's one thing I'd encourage you, if you're a straight, independent, free-thinking man, which is a quote, I think, from Minister Japp, he says something along the same lines, right? If you can think for yourself, you can see through a lot of this manipulation, and you've got to look out for your best interest, whether it's creating informal allies with men at work. It doesn't have to be explicit that in the sense that, oh, we need to form a unity over this type of thing. We're not forming a union, a labor union for men or a men's empowerment group at work. It doesn't have to be something like that, but it could just be that, okay, you're looking out for people who show they're honorable men in one way or another in the corporate environment. The point is that if society's culture and corporate culture doesn't change, you're going to have more and more resentment from men. Men can see through all the lies. I know women are more easily fooled. You can manipulate them emotionally to be consumers or to focus on some kind of victim narrative or oppression narrative, or that they need to be empowered, things like that. You can't really fool men the same way. And that's why you saw, after the whole 2020 fake lockdown situation, which we can't discuss too much on this platform, but men could see through the lies, and all this system could do was the traditional male shaming tactics, far-right conspiracy theorist, they're some kind of deniers, science deniers, things like that. You need to trust the science, it's safe and effective, things like that. If this is what I mean about this system, it's just consistently pitting men or working age, military age men as some kind of threat because they have critical thinking skills to see through the lies. Now that's why men hate corporate culture, and hopefully some corporations out there will make adjustments. We see some pushback against some of these agendas, and particularly with the recent election in America, there seems a bit of a shift in culture. I've worked in the finance industry for over a decade at companies like Goldman and Morgan Stanley. Career advice, link in description if you want to speak with me directly. Let me know in the comments, if you're a man, why do you hate corporate culture? If you're a woman watching, let me know how you feel about different perspectives expressed here. And there are 2 recommended videos on the screen right now, and I'll see you next time.